Welcome everyone to the Lord of Mysteries novel summary series on AniMonolith. In the previous part, Klein reflects on his involvement in the recent mission and the potential dangers from the Secret Order, while Old Neil reassures him that their focus will now be on finding Ray Bieber. Klein receives a bonus for his contribution to the mission, but since he is not yet an official Nighthawk member, he only gets 10% of the reward. He and Old Neil discuss the high salaries and tax-free benefits of being a Beyonder, but Neil explains that the costs of acquiring extraordinary items for research or combat can still be high. Klein is surprised to learn that extraordinary items can be bought on the black market, and Neil explains how certain supernatural materials are traded despite the Church's control. Later, Klein heads to the Divination Club with enough money to become an official member, while Dunn is still on his mission investigating the missing Antigonus family notebook. At the fortune-telling club on the second floor of No. 2 Hole Street in the northern part of Tingen City, Klein once again met the beautiful girl in charge of hospitality. Seeing Klein, the receptionist took the initiative to greet her and said that Glassy, the novice fortune-teller who used to read tarot fortunes for Klein, was not there. Hearing that, Klein was very surprised by the girl's memory, but the girl explained that the reason was very simple: Klein was Glassy's first guest. When he heard the receptionist ask about who he wanted to appoint for fortune-telling, Klein refused because this time he came because he wanted to become a member of the club. After Klein paid the fee, the receptionist gave Klein an invoice for him to fill out with complete information as well as the current company address to easily manage members' information. However, for the date of birth, Klein intentionally left it blank because he thought that as a seer, these numbers can be related to personal mystery, so they need to be kept secret. When Klein completed the formalities, the girl introduced herself as Angelica Barhart, a waitress here. Then she gave Klein a cufflink with a unique Divination Club engraving on it to prove the user's membership status. Klein politely shook Angelica's hand and received the light yellow button. He discovered that the inscription above used the Hermes language, which was fortune-teller. Angelica then asked Klein what aspect of fortune-telling he was talented in, such as tarot fortune-telling or crystal ball fortune-telling, or Klein could also say the field of fortune-telling he wanted to learn. The club would send a teacher, guide him to create. With these issues, Klein was not too concerned. He just answered in general terms, because his purpose was to play the role of seer authentically, not to collect new methods. Klein then asked when he could read fortunes for customers and received the response that whenever a customer requested, Klein could do it. Then, after Klein offered a modest price of 2 cents per fortune-telling, Angelica completed his profile and led him across a conference room. When passing by, Angelica said that there was Mr. Hannes Fansent was explaining star chart divination. Klein can find a quiet place to listen and can also raise his hand to ask unclear questions. Out of curiosity, Klein agreed to this proposal. Then he heard a sound that had the specialty tone of Akova area. Star chart divination is a type of divination that is quite complicated among all other divination techniques. Klein briefly observed the other person and concluded that the other person was just an ordinary person. Then Klein saw 5 or 6 long tables gathered in a semicircle around a middle-aged man wearing a classic black jacket, Hannes Vincent. He had thick, stiff brown hair that stood straight up like he was playing the role of a hedgehog and dark circles around his eyes. Other than that, he doesn't have any outstanding characteristics. However, Klein did not forget to tap his glabella twice to turn on spirit vision to see Hannes Vincent's aura. But what he saw was nothing special, and this even made Klein think that he was starting to resemble a doctor examining a patient. But whatever the result, Klein is very satisfied with this spirit vision ability. Then he carefully looked around, then lightly tapped the glabella twice as if thinking about what Hannes had just said, but actually to turn off spirit vision. Meanwhile, Hannes continued his lecture. Star chart divination is a type of astrology, but ordinary people can try to decode it. For example, the birth star map is based on the position of the sun, moon, blue star, and red star in the sky when a person is born on the star map and is marked with symbols. Their symbols, along with the status of the corresponding constellations, to decode the opponent's destiny. To do this, the fortune-teller must know how to calculate the status of the planets and constellations, which is quite complicated. Of course, some people publish reference books so people can look them up, and others simplify it by only using constellations to decipher the most obscure types. Hannes then requested practice exercises for the students, then he ended the lecture by telling anyone who wanted to discuss the lesson to come to the white glass room to discuss. Then Hannes left the conference room. While Klein was still sitting in his seat, a young man came to talk to him. He called himself Edward Steve and his specialty was tarot fortune-telling and playing cards. He has been in the club for 2 years but has never seen Klein, so he is very curious about Klein. Then when Edward asked Klein if he had any fortune-telling skills, he still only answered vaguely like when he answered Angelica, because Klein didn't want his identity to be revealed. While chatting, Edward was called by the staff to go meet customers because he seemed to be very popular with everyone. However, Edward revealed the secret that can get many people asking for their fortune-telling, which is to set a reasonable price. At the same time, Edward also said that only fools would charge low fortune-telling fees. Hearing that, Klein immediately went to find Angelica and asked her to change the fee he wanted to be higher than the original. Of course, Angelica agreed. After finishing editing the documents, Klein turned and walked back to the conference room. At this time, he saw Hannes Fansent come out of the white glass room, holding a silver mirror. This famous fortune teller said to the 5 members, 3 men and 2 women, in the room, "I recently mastered a new fortune-telling technique, magic mirror fortune-telling. Are there any ladies and gentlemen who want to learn it?" Hearing about magic divination, Klein suddenly felt a bad premonition because this method was inherently unsafe. As a seer who had just stepped through the gates of mysticism, Klein did not dare to claim he knew much. However, he was certain he knew more than ordinary people. He knew the various kinds of divination arts could be split into 3 categories based on particular standards. And that standard was based on the source of the hint. The first divination method includes tarot readings, playing cards, pendulum dowsing, stick divination, and dream interpretations. This method uses the seer's spiritual energy along with the hints obtained by connecting to the spirit world to interpret the results. The second method involves numerology, astrology, and various forms derived from them. The seer relies on objective information gathered through inquiries or natural transformations to calculate, infer, and decode corresponding results. The initiative lies not with the person being read, but with the seer. The third divination method is based on a third force, such as plate divination and pen divination, which belong to this category. This method requires specific rituals to invoke mystical entities for direct answers. While ordinary people practicing this method often do not succeed, if they do succeed and connect with malevolent forces, it can lead to unforeseen consequences. The spirit mirror divination mentioned by Hannes Vincent belongs to the third method. In mysticism, mirrors serve as a gateway connecting to the spiritual world and to the demonic. Therefore, Klein intended only to listen and observe how this renowned seer would explain. If Hannes exhibited suspicious behavior, Klein would consider reporting to Captain Dunn to confiscate his divination tools. Of course, spirit mirror divination also has safer practices, such as seeking answers from the 7 orthodox gods. Though ordinary people rarely receive true hints from this method, it carries no danger or consequences. Klein thought that in a world filled with countless mystical powers, divination methods always tended to veer into darker paths. He even speculated that Welch and Naya had used the Antigonos family's diary to practice black divination. While Klein was contemplating, Hannes Vincent was explaining the theory of how to choose the right time for spirit mirror divination. First, based on the god that the person performing the ritual worships, select an appropriate day and time. This can be determined using the astrology handbook. For example, Sunday symbolizes the Evernight goddess, representing rest, in the times between 2 to 3 a.m., 9 to 10 a.m., 4 to 5 p.m., and 11 p.m. to midnight are when the moon is dominated by the night goddess. Therefore, those who worship the Evernight goddess can perform spirit mirror divination during these times on Sunday. Upon hearing this, Klein had to acknowledge Hannes's solid knowledge. As the 7 churches are currently limiting one another, it also comes with the revelation of mystical knowledge, such as the astrology handbook, which provides many meanings of symbols used in divination. However, without potions or beyond their power, ordinary people could hardly achieve the desired effects. At that moment, Hannes was practicing with props for assisted divination. He said, "For spirit mirror divination, you must carefully wipe the mirror's surface. It must be a silvered mirror, placed in a location symbolizing the moon in the house." However, after being thoroughly instructed by old Neil earlier, Klein disagreed with this. Instead, Klein believed that the logical approach for the next step was to use a pendulum and silently think to himself, "This place is suitable for spirit mirror divination 7 times, then observe the pendulum's direction." If it moved clockwise, the answer was yes. If counterclockwise, the answer was no. Of course, if you are invoking something mystical, the position of the pendulum is no longer crucial. What matters is whether God is interested or not. Since Hanas couldn't read Klein's thoughts, he continued to focus on his lecture. At that moment, Hanas was teaching an important part. After praying 7 times, take the mirror and gently drop it to the ground, making sure to do it very lightly. Remember the shape it takes when it shatters. That is the hint that the divine gives you. Of course, each symbol has its unique meaning, so I will explain them to everyone. Upon hearing this, Klein felt a great sense of relief because Hanas Vincent was explaining orthodox spirit mirror divination. Orthodox means that hints can be received, but there is no true method of interpretation. However, if Beyonders receive responses during this process, they can directly see images in the mirror and obtain relatively clear information. As Klein continued to sit quietly and listen to the lecture, Edward Steve returned after finishing a divination session for a client. Although Klein was curious about what method Edward Steve used for divination, he had no intention of asking. This was an unspoken rule among seers. Their divination methods should only be introduced to clients, not to colleagues. For his part, Klein believed that as a seer, he should adhere to this rule. If Edward Steve didn't bring it up himself, Klein wouldn't ask. Just then, Edward Steve suddenly began discussing how to interpret the hints received or the symbols presented. He believed that this was extremely vague because the seer must rely on the different needs of the client and help them find descriptions of themselves from what was interpreted. Then he sighed, saying, "This journey of yours seems quite challenging, but you can survive." As soon as Edward Steve finished speaking, Klein mentioned the term survivorship bias, which is a philosophical thought of Emperor Roselle. Survival bias generally meant that a lot of statistics would only include those who were alive and lucky. The data would ignore the dead, therefore, the results would be biased. Throughout that afternoon, the students continued to attend Hannes's Spirit Mirror Divination class, and Klein always tried to fulfill his role as an unofficial member of the Nighthawks, which was to guide them away from anything related to extraordinary or dangerous thoughts. However, what Klein most wanted to do, which was to be asked for a reading, did not happen. To escape his situation of not having clients, Klein thought of a plan to market himself or find ways to promote himself as a true seer. But then, he abandoned this idea and stood up to leave. After Klein left, Edward Steve also exited the club a while later. However, on his way to the door, he saw Glassy, a friend with similar interests and also his colleague, so he happily approached him to chat. But upon seeing Glassy's tired appearance and persistent cough, Edward Steve asked about his health. At that moment, Glassy recalled how severely ill he had been, even battling pneumonia at one point. He explained that if it hadn't been for a chance encounter his wife had with a skilled pharmacist, who provided him with a miraculous remedy, he might not be alive today. "You'd be visiting my grave instead," he added somberly. While the two were chatting, Angelica happened to come over. She also inquired about Glassy's health and conveniently mentioned that Klein had just become a club member. Upon hearing Klein's name, Glassy immediately became excited, continually urging Angelica that if Klein came to the club next time and he wasn't there, she should find out when Klein would be coming next so he could meet him. Witnessing Glassy's excessive enthusiasm, Edward Steve asked what Klein had done to make him so eagerly anticipate his presence. Glassy replied, "Klein is an incredibly miraculous person, almost like a doctor.